tension in the Strait of Hormuz has reached a breaking point, and the world is holding its breath. After months of escalating rhetoric and shadow warfare, the United States has shifted from deterrence to active war footing, and we could be mere moments away from a full-scale military confrontation between Washington and Tehran. The clerical establishment in Tehran is scrambling. The most formidable projection of American combat power in a generation is now arrayed against them, and there appears to be no diplomatic off-ramp that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei can seize to de-escalate. The Royal United Services Institute describes the current posture of U.S. forces in the Central Command Area as the most concentrated and combat-ready posture since the opening phases of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Their senior defense analyst, referred to publicly only as M-Men, Reed, has compiled a detailed thread on the Warwatch platform, and the scale of the mobilization is staggering. On March 3rd, the U.S. initiated a major repositioning of long-range strike assets, primarily drawing from the 48th Fighter Wing at RAF Lakenheath and the 1st Fighter Wing at Langley, moving them to forward operating locations within striking distance of Iranian territory. A significant contingent of F-35A Lightning II stealth fighters was relocated, with Reed's tracking indicating no fewer than 22 aircraft dispersing to bases in Qatar, the UAE, and potentially undisclosed desert strips. Supporting this vanguard were multiple KC-46A Pegasus tankers, the next-generation aerial refueling workhorses that dramatically extend the loiter time and combat radius of America's fighter and bomber fleets. Also detected moving eastward were several E-7A Wedgetail airborne early warning and control aircraft, which will provide a critical battle management layer, tracking hundreds of air and surface contacts simultaneously over the Persian Gulf and Iranian plateau. This initial surge was executed in a 48-hour window. March 4th saw an even more pronounced acceleration. Multiple squadrons of F-15EX Eagle II advanced tactical fighters were forwarded deployed, bringing with them massive payloads of precision-guided munitions. These were complemented by additional Wedgetail and Pegasus platforms, creating a dense, resilient network of sensors and shooters. The U.S. has also activated and moved elements of its 40th Expeditionary Bomb Squadron, with B-1B Lancer strategic bombers now operating from a secure location in the region, capable of launching long-range standoff missiles like the JASSM-R against heavily defended targets deep inside Iran. When you layer this new arrival on top of the carrier air wings and land-based assets already in theater as part of the ongoing enhanced vigilance activity, you are looking at perhaps the most potent and integrated air combat ensemble ever positioned for a single regional contingency, all focused on Iran in a matter of days. Reuters adds further granularity, reporting that this rapid surge builds upon a steady, quieter buildup over the preceding month. Since late February, the outlet notes, the U.S. border has repositioned an RQ-180 stealth reconnaissance drone to a secure facility in the region, though its exact operating base remains classified. A detachment of AC-130J Ghost Rider gunships has been moved to Al Dhafar Air Base in the UAE, providing a persistent, precision close-air support and armed overwatch capability. An EA-37B Compass Call electronic attack aircraft is now operating from a location in the eastern Mediterranean, capable of disrupting Iranian air defense networks and command nodes. A MQ-9B Sky Guardian armed drone, with its long endurance and multi-spectral sensors, is now patterned over the Arabian Sea, focused on maritime surveillance and potential strike roles. And in Kuwait, the U.S. has pre-positioned additional Patriot PAC-3, MSE, and THA THAAD missile defense batteries, along with a company of Army Special Forces for terminal guidance and liaison duties. What we are witnessing is not a routine exercise or a show of force. This is the deliberate, phased assembly of a joint task force for major combat operations, states former CENTCOM planner, Colonel Ret. David Vance, in his assessment of the current situation. He emphasizes that the momentum is still building. The logistics tail is still flowing. Ammunition, spare parts, and personnel are moving at a pace I haven't seen since the 1991 Gulf War buildup. This is a force being prepared to fight, not just to posture. Indeed, the scale evokes comparisons to the largest U.S. military mobilizations of the post-Cold War era. Now, a critical component is absent from this formidable array. But before addressing that, we must examine the maritime dimension of this looming confrontation. The U.S. effort extends far beyond air bases. It has established a dominant naval presence in the Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf, designed to control the seas, launch strikes, and enforce a potential quarantine. As reported by Naval News on March 2nd, the USS George H.W. Bush CVN-77, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, is now operating in the North Arabian Sea with its full carrier strike group. This group includes at least 4 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers and a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, with the carrier's Air Wing Carrier Air Wing 7 embarking nearly 70 aircraft, including FA-18E F Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, and E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes. This formidable force is set to be reinforced by the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN-69, which Defense One reported was transiting the Suez Canal on March 5, heading east at high speed. The arrival of a second carrier strike group would double the available sortie generation rate and provide immense flexibility and redundancy for naval aviation operations against Iranian targets. The U.S. Naval Institute provides a detailed order of battle for the maritime forces now converging on Iran's coastline. The USS George H.W. Bush strike group in the Arabian Sea is complemented by a separate surface action group in the Gulf of Oman, featuring a destroyer and a littoral combat ship equipped with naval strike missiles. In the Persian Gulf itself, the U.S. Fifth Fleet has concentrated the task force of mine countermeasures vessels, patrol craft, and additional destroyers to secure vital choke points and counter the threat from Iranian fast attack craft and naval mines. The incoming USS Dwight D. Eisenhower will bring its own complement of F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters, adding a fifth-generation strike capability to the naval air power equation. Like all U.S. carriers, it also embarks MH-60R/Seahawk helicopters for anti-submarine warfare and search and rescue missions. The sheer concentration of tonnage, firepower, and sensors in this relatively confined maritime space is unprecedented in recent history. This isn't merely a demonstration. It is the practical arrangement of forces for sustained, high-intensity combat. So stay with us, because later we'll explore what the first 72 hours of such a conflict might look like. The glaring omission from this vast buildup, as Colonel Vance notes, is large-scale ground forces. If we're drawing a parallel to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the most obvious difference is the absence of heavy armored divisions, Marine Expeditionary Brigades, and the vast logistical infrastructure needed to support a ground campaign into Iranian territory, Vance explains. This observation is astute. Despite the bellicose language and the mobilization of overwhelming air and naval power, the U.S. has shown no indication of preparing for a ground invasion of Iran. This aligns with consistent statements from the highest levels of the U.S. government. In the aftermath of the 2024 Operation Silent Anvil, strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz explicitly stated that the objective was to degrade capabilities, not to occupy territory, and that the U.S. had zero intention of committing American ground troops to a war inside Iran. That stated policy continues to shape the current crisis. The ongoing nuclear negotiations, however tense, are a direct outgrowth of that limited, objective strategy. Before delving into those talks, it's worth noting that Waltz's position has been echoed by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who addressed a gathering of Iranian diaspora communities, expressing solidarity with their aspirations for freedom, but carefully stating that American support would not include boots on the ground for regime change. The message is consistent, if not entirely reassuring. The U.S. seeks to apply decisive pressure from the air and sea, but wishes to avoid the quagmire of a land war. Whether that calculus holds under the fog of war is the paramount question. As a failed air campaign could create irresistible pressure for escalation, Iran, for its part, is not a passive observer awaiting its fate. It is actively preparing for the storm it believes is coming. A brief interlude. You are watching Global Defense Brief. If you find this analysis valuable, please subscribe to stay informed on these critical developments. Regarding Iran's preparations, Associated Press reporting indicates that the Islamic Republic is hardening its key military and nuclear sites against an anticipated U.S. and Israeli air campaign. Facilities that were previously targeted or assessed as vulnerable are now undergoing significant fortification. Iranian engineers are reportedly layering sites with reinforced concrete, earth berms, and decoy structures, aiming to complicate targeting and absorb the impact of precision munitions. For example, the Fordow Fuel Enrichment Plant, buried deep inside a mountain, is seeing its external approaches and ventilation shafts further fortified with additional concrete and camouflage netting, designed to defeat both satellite imagery and the effects of nearby detonations. This hardening campaign aims to force the U.S. to expend more munitions, use riskier tactics, or accept that some targets may survive an initial strike. On the offensive side, The Financial Times reported on March 4 that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, is implementing a distributed command protocol, decentralizing authority for missile and drone launches to regional commanders. This is intended to ensure continuity of operations even if central leadership nodes in Tehran are degraded by cyber or kinetic attacks. The IRGC naval forces have also increased patrols and mine-laying exercises in the Strait of Hormuz, though analysts debate whether their asymmetric swarm tactics could seriously challenge the U.S. Navy's layered defenses in a sustained conflict. When combined with Iran's estimated arsenal of over 3,000 short and medium-range ballistic missiles, the country possesses a significant retaliatory capability that could threaten U.S. bases, allied capitals, and global energy flows if diplomacy collapses. Iran's strategic dilemma is acute. It faces a technologically superior adversary that appears poised to strike, and every hour that passes allows the U.S. to further refine its targeting and integrate its forces. A swift U.S. opening strike could severely limit Iran's ability to react effectively. Intelligence suggests such a rapid strike is a live option, with some reports indicating the U.S. military could be prepared to initiate combat operations as early as March 8. This timeline, cited by multiple Western intelligence sources, suggests the White House has been presented with a menu of strike options that could be executed within a narrow window, capitalizing on the current concentration of forces. Ultimately, the decision to cross that threshold rests with one individual, U.S. President Donald Trump. His calculus will be influenced by a complex mix of military advice, diplomatic signals, and domestic political considerations, which we will examine shortly. The immediate trajectory of this crisis hinges significantly on the stalled nuclear negotiations between U.S. and Iranian intermediaries. Talks held in Muscat on March 3 lasted nearly 4 hours but ended without a breakthrough. According to Omani officials, White House spokesperson Abigail Harrison stated that Iran was expected to present a more substantive and actionable proposal in the coming days. But she also noted that the president has not authorized any deadlines for diplomacy and that all options remain on the table. In essence, the military machine is primed, but the political trigger has not yet been pulled. Iranian officials, conversely, project a sense of having more diplomatic space. On March 4, Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Ali Bagheri Khani told state media that the Muscat talks had established a framework for serious negotiation, though he conceded significant gaps remain. The central uncertainty is whether the U.S. interprets Iran's negotiating posture as genuine or as a deliberate stalling tactic to buy time for military preparations. Time is arguably Iran's most scarce resource at this moment. Each day of delay allows for further fortification and dispersal of its assets. Colonel David Vance assesses that the prevailing view in Washington is likely pessimistic regarding the talks. The diplomatic language of agreeing to continue discussions is often a polite way of saying the parties are far apart and no one wants to be blamed for the collapse, Vance notes. When you juxtapose the U.S. demands for verifiable, permanent restrictions on Iran's nuclear program and its regional activities, with Iran's insistence on immediate sanctions relief and recognition of its rightful regional role, the gap seems almost unbridgeable. If this assessment is correct, then the massive military assembly around Iran may transition from a tool of coercion to the opening act of a war in the very near future. Whether that happens this weekend or later depends on the factor we previously mentioned. While U.S. planners are confident in their ability to inflict severe damage on Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure, President Trump must weigh the risk that a campaign intended to be decisive could instead ignite a wider, grinding conflict that destabilizes the entire Middle East. Colonel Vance points out that the U.S. is still refining its strategic end state for Iran. Is the goal a return to a constrained nuclear deal? Is it the permanent neutralization of Iran's nuclear weapons potential? Or is it the fundamental alteration of the regime in Tehran? He asks. The answers to these questions dictate the scale, duration, and intensity of the military action contemplated. These strategic questions will directly inform the president's decision, requiring a clear-eyed analysis of the potential benefits and catastrophic risks of initiating hostilities. Should the U.S. proceed, initial strikes over a weekend could merely be the prelude to a sustained air and missile campaign lasting weeks or months, aimed at systematically dismantling Iran's military command, nuclear program, and Revolutionary Guard infrastructure, according to sources familiar with planning documents cited by the Jerusalem Post. Other analysts quoted in the same report suggest a high probability of kinetic military action within the next 10 to 14 days. If conflict erupts, one significant advantage for the U.S. at least initially, would be the active partnership of Israel. As reported by Times of Israel, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has coordinated closely with the U.S. on a strategy of maximum pressure and precise action against Iranian threats. Netanyahu has reportedly advised the president that any diplomatic agreement that leaves Iran's nuclear infrastructure intact is merely a temporary delay, implying Israel's readiness to act independently if necessary, which could in turn draw the U.S. deeper into the conflict. This alliance means the U.S. would not be acting alone, gaining access to invaluable intelligence, basing, and potentially specialized munitions. Furthermore, a March 1 analysis from the Center for a New American Security outlined several strategic rationales that could motivate U.S. military action. Foremost among them is the perceived vulnerability of the Iranian regime, which faces significant economic strain and public discontent, potentially making it less resilient to external shock. This could present a historic, if risky, opportunity to alter the regional balance of power. The weight given to this factor depends entirely on whether the administration's primary aim is non-proliferation or regime change. The ethical argument stemming from the Iranian government's suppression of domestic dissent and its support for regional proxy militias adds another layer to the case for action, particularly framed as a humanitarian intervention. The CNAS report also suggests that after such a massive mobilization, failing to act if talks fail could damage U.S. credibility with allies and adversaries alike. The potential to bring Iran's vast oil and gas reserves into a more stable, Western-aligned market following regime change represents a significant long-term economic and strategic prize, as does the opportunity to firmly counter Iranian influence across the Middle East. Naturally, decisively ending the Iranian nuclear weapons program through military means would be a monumental strategic achievement. This catalog of potential benefits presents a compelling, if dangerous, case for the use of force, and perhaps it will prove decisive. However, numerous strategic analyses highlight the profound risks inherent in this course. As War on the Rocks details, a U.S. campaign that fails to achieve rapid, overwhelming success could trigger a prolonged conflict that escalates beyond initial intentions. Iran possesses considerable capacity to protract a war, particularly through asymmetric means: swarms of anti-ship missiles and drones, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, activation of proxy networks across the region, and attempts to close the Strait of Hormuz. If the U.S. objective is perceived in Tehran as existential regime change, rather than a limited punitive strike, Iranian resistance would likely be far more tenacious and widespread. If the leadership in Tehran believes the ultimate U.S. goal is their overthrow, they will fight with everything they have, mobilizing the entire state and its proxies for a war of national survival, not a limited exchange, argues a recent War on the Rocks commentary. This would transform the conflict from a potentially short, sharp air campaign into a grinding regional war, with unpredictable and potentially devastating consequences. Neighboring states are acutely aware of this escalation ladder. Iran's state-run Press TV notes that countries including Iraq, Kuwait, Pakistan, and even traditional U.S. partners like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have urgently called for restraint and diplomatic solutions, fearing they would bear the brunt of any regional conflagration. President Trump must also consider the domestic political ramifications of escalation. Conducting a limited airstrike is one political calculation. Managing a war that could see American casualties, skyrocketing oil prices, and calls for ground troop deployment is an entirely different and far more perilous political undertaking. The inherent and severe risks of war with Iran are almost certainly the primary factors giving President Trump pause. At this moment, the United States has moved beyond mere signaling. It is positioned a war-winning force, yet it has not yet initiated hostilities. It is possible that diplomacy, however faint the hope, could still de-escalate the crisis. But if talks definitively fail, Iran may face the consequences of what Washington perceives as intransigence. In that scenario, the assembled U.S. military power could be unleashed as early as March 8. The coming days will reveal whether Iran's defenses can withstand a focused American assault, or whether Tehran has successfully prepared to turn a potential blitz into a war of attrition. One global leader observing this crisis with intense focus is China's President Xi Jinping. Why? A major war in the Persian Gulf that disrupts global energy supplies and draws in major powers would profoundly impact China's economic security and its strategic ambitions in the Middle East. Furthermore, a U.S.-Iran conflict could force China into a difficult diplomatic position, balancing its economic ties with Tehran against its broader relationship with Washington. The outcome could reshape the geopolitical landscape of Eurasia for decades, as we explore in our companion analysis. If you found this deep dive into the military dynamics valuable, please subscribe to Global Defense Brief for more expert, timely analysis on the world's most critical security issues. And remember to subscribe to the channel for more analysis of what's really happening in the Ukraine war.